At 78 years old, Sergeant First Class Harold Hal Murphy had faced down bullets, battlefield trauma, and the brutal chaos of combat as a decorated Army medic. But nothing prepared him for the cold indifference of a hospital front desk. Clutching his chest, Hal stumbled into County General's emergency room, his breath ragged, his face pale with pain. Classic heart attack symptoms. But instead of immediate medical aid, he was met with bureaucratic stonewalling. His wallet, containing his VA ID, driver's license, and insurance card, had been stolen the day before. And though he explained this urgently, all the intake clerk Brenda could do was point at a sign. Valid photo ID and insurance required. Hal pulled out the only document he had. His crumpled DD-214 discharge papers, proof of decades of honorable military service. But Nurse Henderson, supervising the intake, dismissed the form. "Policy is policy," she said flatly, without making eye contact. They told him unless he could provide verifiable photo ID and insurance, they couldn't admit him for non-critical care. But this was critical. Hal was sweating, lightheaded, and in obvious distress. Yet because he couldn't prove his identity with a plastic card, the people trained to save lives turned their backs. As Hal lowered himself into a hard plastic chair, chest still aching, he realized something chilling. After serving this country for 30 years, he was being denied care by the very system he had once risked his life to defend. Sergeant First Class Harold Hal Murphy had been trained to stay calm under fire, but nothing in his decades of service had prepared him for the cold machinery of hospital bureaucracy. Slumped over the ER counter at County General, Hal explained as clearly as his labored breath would allow. He was a VA patient with a service-connected heart condition. His cardiologist, Dr. Evans at the VA hospital, knew his entire history. He wasn't asking for special treatment, just the life-saving care his symptoms clearly warranted. Chest pain radiating down his arm, shortness of breath, dizziness. He knew the signs as well as any doctor. "You can call Dr. Evans. She'll confirm everything," Hal pleaded, desperation rising in his voice. But Nurse Henderson shook her head with professional detachment. "Without verifiable photo ID and current insurance documentation, we can't establish a file. We cannot treat you beyond basic stabilization." She handed him a list of urgent care clinics and suggested he either contact his insurance provider himself or prepare to pay out of pocket. The message was brutally clear. Without a plastic card to scan, his service, his symptoms, even his pain, didn't count. Hal stared at the nurse, stunned. "I served this country for over 30 years, he rasped. "I've pulled men out of fire zones, patched them up with nothing but gauze and grit, and now, because I lost my wallet, I can't get help?" Brenda, the intake clerk, glanced up briefly, then back to her screen. "That's policy," she mumbled. "No ID, no insurance, no file. We're sorry." But they weren't. Not really. Not enough to act. And as Hal's body trembled and the ache in his chest deepened, he realized how meaningless his sacrifice felt in that moment. A man who had saved lives in war was now being told to sit down, stay quiet, and wait, because the system needed forms, not facts. Hal tried to steady himself, fumbling in his jacket for his DD-214 again, but it may as well have been a scrap of paper. They didn't even look at it. He stumbled toward the hard plastic chairs lining the waiting room wall and collapsed into one, beads of sweat dotting his brow. Around him, the sounds of the ER continued. Phones ringing, machines beeping, patients groaning. But no one moved to help him. The feeling of humiliation sank deeper than the pain in his chest. He was not asking for a handout, just acknowledgement of his service, his condition, his humanity. That a modern American hospital could turn away a visibly suffering veteran for lack of a photo ID was something Hal had never imagined possible. Not here. Not in the country he'd spent his life defending. As the seconds crawled by, Hal realized he needed help, fast, but not from the people he thought he could trust. Reaching into his coat pocket with a shaking hand, he found his old flip phone and scrolled through the faded contacts. There was only one name that made sense to call now. Colonel David Sterling, his former commanding officer, a man Hal had once mentored in the field. It was a long shot, but it was his last hope. The pain in Hal Murphy's chest was unrelenting, a vice grip radiating down his left arm, making every breath feel like a battle. Slumped in the hard plastic chair of County General's emergency room, ignored and dismissed by the very system he once served, Hal reached for his phone with trembling fingers. He couldn't think straight, but one number cut through the fog of pain and humiliation. Colonel Daniel Reed, his old commanding officer. Hal had mentored Reed when he was just a green lieutenant in the field. And though they hadn't spoken in years, Hal knew one thing with certainty. Reed wouldn't let him die in a waiting room over paperwork. With what strength he could muster, Hal dialed. The line rang 3 times before a sharp, familiar voice answered. "Colonel Reed," came the crisp tone. "Sir, it's Hal Murphy," he gasped. "I'm at County General. Chest pain. They won't treat me. Wallet stolen. No ID. VA patient. They won't help." There was a beat of silence, and then the edge in Reed's voice sharpened like steel. "Stay put, Sergeant. Don't argue. I'm 5 minutes away. I'll be there, and I'm making a call on the way." The line clicked. Hal closed his eyes and exhaled, clinging to the sliver of hope that came with Reed's voice. The waiting room buzzed on, the intake clerk chatting on her headset, the nurse flipping through charts. No one looked at him. No one moved. 5 minutes later, the ER doors burst open with a force that shattered the quiet indifference in the room. Colonel Daniel Reed stormed in, still in his crisp Army combat uniform, boots echoing across the tile floor. His presence was commanding, his eyes locked instantly on Hal's slumped figure. He moved with speed and purpose, kneeling beside Hal. "Hang in there, Sergeant. Help's here," he said. Right behind him came a captain with a stethoscope around his neck and a master sergeant carrying a fully stocked medical kit. They began treating Hal immediately. Oxygen, vitals, the works. Reed didn't even glance at the front desk. He walked straight up to Nurse Henderson, who had frozen mid-step. "This man," Reed began, his voice calm but thunderously firm, "is Sergeant First Class Harold Murphy, retired United States Army. A decorated combat medic. He's experiencing cardiac distress. Your facility refused him care over missing ID, despite him being a VA patient with a known heart condition. That ends now." Ms. Henderson began to sputter. "Colonel, our hospital policy—" "Your policy," Reed cut in coldly, "is about to be superseded by federal law and medical ethics. You've denied emergency care to a documented veteran over paperwork. You'll answer for that." He turned to the Army medic. "Captain Blake, continue treatment. Get him stable." Then to the front desk. "And someone better open the cardiac unit, now!" Brenda, the intake clerk, stared in stunned silence as a gurney appeared, and Hal was lifted gently onto it. Suddenly, the doors to the restricted area were wide open, staff paging cardiologists, nurses rushing into motion. It was as if the ER had remembered what its purpose was. Not policies, but people. Not forms, but lives. Reed wasn't done. "I've already contacted the VA regional director and the hospital's administrator. who I believe served in the Navy. He'll be very interested in how his staff treated a veteran with life-threatening symptoms. And if this delay results in lasting damage or worse, this will go well beyond hospital reviews." He pulled out his own military ID and added quietly, "If your system requires a credit card to begin treatment, you can use mine." Colonel Reed never left Hal's side until he was safely in the cardiac ICU, receiving the proper care he had been cruelly denied. And in that moment, the message was clear. When a veteran is abandoned by the system, it may take the force of an old commander's voice and uniform to cut through the red tape and restore dignity, respect, and life-saving care. Colonel Daniel Reed stood firm in the center of the ER, a figure of unwavering authority. The staff, who only minutes earlier had refused to admit Sergeant First Class Harold Hal Murphy, were now scrambling to respond. Reed had made it clear. This wasn't just another paperwork issue. This was a veteran's life on the line, and it was about to become a national matter if it wasn't handled immediately. As Army medics administered oxygen and monitored Hal's vitals, Reed pulled out his military ID and addressed the supervising nurse, Ms. Henderson, directly. "I am vouching for this man's identity and his VA eligibility. If it's money you're worried about, here, use my credit card. Charge whatever you need. But this man will be treated, and he will be treated now." Ms. Henderson looked stunned. Brenda, the intake clerk who had earlier dismissed Hal's pleas, stood frozen behind her station, her expression a mix of disbelief and regret. It wasn't just the colonel's presence that had shaken them. It was the sudden collapse of the bureaucracy they had been hiding behind. Reed didn't stop there. He calmly informed the ER staff that he had already spoken to the regional director of the Department of Veterans Affairs and the hospital's chief administrator, who, as it turned out, was a retired Navy captain. Both had been briefed on the incident and were en route. The message was unmistakable. Higher authorities were watching, and accountability was no longer optional. Within moments, the tone of the ER shifted. The tension among staff turned into urgency, not to deny, but to assist. Hal was gently lifted onto a gurney and wheeled down the hallway toward the cardiac ICU, now miraculously cleared for his admission. A cardiologist who had previously been unavailable was suddenly on call. The doors that once seemed locked by red tape had been flung open, not by protocol, but by the weight of responsibility. Colonel Reed followed the medical team closely, never letting Hal out of his sight. It wasn't just duty, it was personal. This was the man who had once patched up his wounds in a combat zone, the same man who had pulled others to safety under fire. Hal had given his youth, strength, and decades of service to this country. Reed would not let his sacrifice be forgotten in a cold waiting room. Roughly an hour later, the hospital's chief administrator, Captain Walter Mason, arrived at the ER. He moved with urgency and purpose, approaching Colonel Reed with a somber expression. "Colonel," Mason said, offering his hand, "I've been fully briefed. This never should have happened. I offer my deepest apology on behalf of County General." Reed nodded but didn't return the handshake right away. "This nearly cost a man his life, Captain. Hal Murphy deserved better." "I agree," Mason replied. "A full investigation has already begun. The intake procedures, staff conduct, everything is under review. There will be consequences." Only then did Reed shake his hand. "Good. That's the least he deserves." Back in the ICU, Hal was finally resting, hooked to monitors, stabilized, and receiving care that should have been given the moment he walked through those ER doors. The Army medics remained with him until the hospital staff took over, ensuring continuity of care. Bureaucracy had nearly claimed a hero's life, but it couldn't withstand the resolve of a commander unwilling to let one of his own be forgotten. What unfolded in that ER became a quiet but powerful statement. Red tape cannot come before human life, especially not for those who once risked theirs for others. Sergeant First Class Harold Hal Murphy had suffered a serious cardiac event, one that could have ended his life if not for the immediate intervention of Colonel Daniel Reed. Though Hal arrived at the ER gasping for breath and clutching his chest, bureaucracy stood in the way of treatment. It wasn't until Reed stormed in and took command that Hal received the life-saving care he had earned through decades of sacrifice. His story didn't make national headlines. Hospitals don't like broadcasting failures, but it echoed through veteran circles across the country. What followed was real change. County General Hospital implemented sweeping reforms in their intake procedures, ensuring that no veteran or emergency patient would ever again be denied care because of a missing ID or insurance card. Hal's near tragedy became the catalyst for long overdue accountability. His story is a reminder that real heroes don't stop serving when they hang up the uniform. Sometimes it takes another soldier to fight the battles still left at home, not with weapons, but with principle, presence, and power. If this story moved you, leave a comment below with the word honor to show your respect for Hal and all who serve. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because these stories matter and they deserve to be heard.